I never imagined that betrayal would announce itself so quietly. I had always assumed it would arrive with drama, raised voices, slammed doors, a shocking confession delivered in anger or guilt. I pictured tears, accusations, maybe even a final, explosive argument that would mark the exact moment everything broke. Instead, it came like a whisper, subtle and persistent, slipping into my life so gently that I almost missed it. At first, it was just a feeling, a slow, unsettling shift that settled in my chest and refused to leave. It lingered there, heavy and unnamed, like a question I was afraid to ask. My husband, Arun, had become distant in a way that felt deliberate. Not cold exactly, but removed, as though his body was present while his mind lived elsewhere. He smiled less, his laughter seemed forced, and when I spoke, he listened with only half his attention. Our home, once filled with easy conversation and shared routines, had begun to feel like a hotel he merely passed through. We had been married for 7 years. 7 years of building a life together. Inside jokes, quiet Sunday mornings, late-night conversations about nothing and everything. We were not perfect, but we were steady. Or so I believed. That was why the change felt so alarming. It wasn't sudden enough to demand confrontation, yet it was consistent enough to erode my sense of security day by day. One evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, the realization hit me with startling clarity. Arun had not asked me a single question about my day. Not once. I had talked about work, about a colleague's promotion, about traffic and exhaustion, filling the silence because it made me uncomfortable. He nodded occasionally, murmured responses that required no real engagement. His phone lay beside his plate, lighting up every few minutes. Each time it did, his eyes softened in a way I had not seen directed at me in months. He never picked it up in front of me, but the way he angled the screen away told me everything I needed to know. I told myself I was imagining things. Marriage had seasons, people said. Long marriages especially. Passion ebbed and flowed. Routine replaced excitement. I repeated these ideas like a mantra, clinging to them because the alternative was too frightening to consider. But deep down, beneath all my rationalizations, I knew something was wrong. The silence between us was no longer comfortable. It was loaded. The truth arrived on an ordinary afternoon. Nothing about the day felt significant when I woke up. I decided, almost on a whim, to surprise Arun with lunch at his office. It felt like something a good wife would do, something normal, something hopeful. I packed his favorite meal, imagining his smile when he saw me, imagining the brief reconnection we so desperately needed. When I reached the office lobby, the receptionist looked confused. Arun had left early, she said, smiling politely, checking her screen as if to confirm. I thanked her and turned away, my chest tightening. He hadn't mentioned leaving early. A strange instinct told me not to go home. Instead, I got into my car and drove without direction, my hands moving the steering wheel while my thoughts raced ahead of me. I don't know what led me to that cafe across town. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was desperation. I parked across the street, telling myself I was ridiculous, that I would sit there for a minute and then go home. And then I saw him. Arun was sitting by the window, laughing, leaning in close to a woman I had never seen before. The world seemed to narrow to that single image. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I watched them through the glass. I did not storm inside. I did not scream or cry. I simply watched. The way he touched her hand, casual, intimate. The way she smiled back, comfortable, familiar. It was practiced. Whatever this was, it wasn't new. This wasn't a mistake born of a bad day or a moment of weakness. This was something that had been happening long enough to feel natural to him. I sat there longer than I should have, committing every detail to memory. The tilt of his head, the ease in his posture. The man I saw was not the one who came home tired and distracted every night. This version of him was present, alive. I drove home in silence, my heart pounding louder than the engine. I don't remember the traffic or the turns I took. I only remember the numbness settling in, spreading through me like frost. That night, Arun came home late. He kissed my forehead and said he was tired. His lips lingered for a moment, as if nothing in the world had changed. I looked at him and realized the man I loved was already gone. I did not confront him. Not yet. Anger came later. First came shock, then a quiet, aching grief. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Betrayal was painful, but what hurt more was how easily he lied. How effortlessly he slipped into bed beside me like nothing had happened. How normal he made deception look. As the days passed, I began to notice everything. The changed passwords. The way he guarded his phone like a secret extension of himself. The sudden concern about his appearance. The new clothes. The extra time spent in front of the mirror. The excuses that came too quickly, too smoothly. Every detail added another crack to the foundation of the life I thought we shared. Slowly, quietly, my grief hardened into clarity. I stopped asking for affection that wasn't coming. I stopped explaining myself to someone who wasn't listening. Instead, I observed. I learned. I waited. I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next would not be impulsive. I would not beg. I would not break down. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. I would let the truth reveal itself. And I had no idea how devastating that revelation would become, for all of us. Living with someone who is betraying you is a unique kind of torment. It is not loud or dramatic. It does not demand immediate action. Instead, it settles into your daily life, disguising itself as normalcy while quietly poisoning everything it touches. Every shared moment feels false. Every laugh echoes hollow. Every conversation feels rehearsed. I became an observer in my own marriage, watching Arun perform the role of a devoted husband while building another life outside our walls. Mornings were the hardest. We still followed our routines, coffee in the kitchen, polite exchanges about the day ahead, the illusion of partnership. He would kiss my cheek before leaving, his touch light and practiced, and I would stand there afterward, staring at the door long after it closed. I wondered how many versions of himself he carried into the world each day, and which one had ever truly belonged to me. At night, the distance between us grew more pronounced. Even when he lay beside me, he felt unreachable. His body was present, but his mind was elsewhere. I could sense it in the way he turned away after a few minutes, in the silence that replaced the conversations we once had. I stopped reaching for him, not out of pride, but because something inside me had begun to shut down. One evening, while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the bedside table. I had promised myself I would not look. I had repeated it over and over like a rule that could somehow preserve my dignity. But rules are fragile things when truth demands to be seen. The screen lit up with a message preview that erased any remaining doubt. The message was affectionate, familiar, confident. There was no hesitation in the words, no attempt to hide. This was not a secret born of guilt or fear. It was a relationship built on certainty, on repetition, on trust, just not with me. I did not pick up the phone. I did not need to. The few words I saw were enough to confirm everything I had already sensed. I sat on the edge of the bed long after the screen went dark, listening to the sound of water running in the bathroom. I realized then that the man I married no longer existed. Or perhaps he never did. Perhaps the version of Arun I loved had been a carefully constructed illusion, one that had finally cracked under the weight of his own choices. What Arun did not know was that betrayal has consequences far beyond heartbreak. Lies leave trails. They seep into places people forget to clean up. And careless people often forget how fragile the worlds they build truly are. In the weeks that followed, his deception began to unravel on its own. I did not have to search for evidence. It appeared everywhere once I knew how to see it. He missed commitments at work, something that had never happened before. There were unexplained financial irregularities, accounts he avoided discussing, expenses that didn't align with his explanations. He became increasingly irritable, snapping at minor inconveniences, carrying tension with him like a shadow. His affair was not just emotional. It was entangled in his professional life in ways he had not considered. I could sense it in the way he avoided certain topics, the way he took calls in other rooms, the way his confidence began to crack under pressure. The man who once moved through the world effortlessly now seemed constantly on edge, as if he were waiting for something to collapse. One night, I overheard him arguing on the phone. I was in the kitchen when his voice carried down the hallway, sharp and low, stripped of its usual composure. He wasn't charming or persuasive. He was desperate. He paced the room, running a hand through his hair, repeating the same reassurances that no longer sounded convincing, even to himself. "I told you it would be handled," he said. "Just give me time." I stood still, my breath caught in my chest. That was the moment I realized his betrayal was already turning into something much bigger than he could control. This wasn't just about another woman. This was about risk, about choices made carelessly, without regard for consequence. I did not interfere. I watched. I listened. I learned. Fragments of truth revealed themselves slowly. The woman he was seeing was not just someone he met by chance. She was connected to a business deal he had hidden from his company. One that crossed ethical lines. One that involved money that was not his to move. Arun had convinced himself he was invincible, that his charm, his confidence, his ability to talk his way out of trouble would protect him. He had always believed rules were flexible, consequences negotiable. He believed he was smarter than the systems around him. And for a long time, that belief had served him well. But lies collapse under their own weight. The pressure began to show. He slept poorly. His appetite disappeared. He checked his phone obsessively, not with excitement this time, but with dread. I could see the shift in him clearly, the transformation from arrogance to anxiety. The man who once felt untouchable now looked increasingly fragile. When the first call came from his office, asking questions he could not answer, I was in the room. He froze mid-sentence, his face draining of color as he listened. His voice faltered when he responded, offering vague explanations that convinced no one. When he hung up, he stood there in silence, staring at nothing. For the first time since I had known him, Arun looked small. That was when I understood the full scope of what was happening. His betrayal was not just personal. It was structural. It was woven into every aspect of his life, his marriage, his work, his identity. He had built everything on deception, and now the foundation was cracking. I felt no satisfaction in his fear. Only a quiet, steady certainty. The truth was no longer something I needed to uncover. It was already emerging on its own, unstoppable. His betrayal was a ticking clock. And when it exploded, it would destroy more than our marriage. The disaster began quietly, like most tragedies do. There was no sudden collapse, no single moment where everything shattered at once. Instead, it unfolded in fragments. An audit announced in a carefully worded email, a suspension framed as temporary, rumors circulating faster than any official explanation. Arun tried to dismiss it at first, brushing off my questions with forced confidence, but I could see the truth in his eyes. The ground beneath him was shifting, and he knew it. He stopped sleeping almost immediately. Nights that once passed in silence were now filled with restless movement. He paced the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands, checked his phone obsessively. The confident man who once laughed off responsibility now moved through the house like a stranger, tense and brittle. Even his voice had changed, lower, sharper, stripped of its usual ease. Pretending became impossible. The mask he had worn for so long cracked under pressure. He forgot small details, contradicted himself. His stories no longer aligned. And I watched it all with a strange sense of detachment, as though I were witnessing the unraveling of someone I no longer recognized as my husband. One evening, after days of silence and avoidance, he finally broke. We were sitting in the living room, the lights dim, the television muted. He stood near the window, his reflection faint against the glass. When he spoke, his voice was unsteady, trembling with something that resembled honesty, but was rooted in fear. He confessed everything. Not gently, not thoughtfully. The truth spilled out in fragments, disorganized and frantic. His affair, the secrecy, the risks he had taken without considering consequences. Contracts signed under false pretenses. Money moved without proper authorization. Favors exchanged where none should have existed. Trust broken at every level, professional and personal. I listened without interruption. I did not ask questions. I did not raise my voice. I simply sat there, absorbing the weight of his words. I felt no satisfaction in finally hearing the truth spoken aloud. There was no relief. Only a heavy, aching sadness. For the years I had given to someone who gambled everything and lost, and for the life I thought we were building together. He talked for a long time. Longer than I expected. When he finished, he looked at me as though waiting for absolution, for reassurance, for rescue. But all I felt was exhaustion. The investigation escalated quickly after that. What had begun as internal scrutiny expanded into something far more serious. Authorities became involved. Formal letters arrived. Phone calls came at odd hours. The company distanced itself publicly, issuing statements that emphasized their lack of involvement. Arun became defensive, then withdrawn, then openly afraid. Friends stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. Messages went unanswered. People who once praised his ambition now avoided his name entirely. The woman he had risked everything for, the one who had been so confident, so present, vanished the moment consequences arrived. She stopped responding to his messages, stopped returning calls. Whatever loyalty they shared had not survived reality. I watched him spiral, torn between guilt and resentment. He blamed everyone, his colleagues, the system, bad timing. At times, he even blamed me, accusing my silence of being judgment. But I had no words left to give him. I had already said everything that mattered with my stillness. When the weight of it all became undeniable, Arun begged me to stand by him. He pleaded with a desperation that shocked me. He asked me to support his version of events, to stay quiet, to lie if necessary. He spoke of marriage as obligation, of loyalty as something owed regardless of truth. He framed it as survival, as though protecting him was the only way forward for both of us. That was the moment everything became clear. Betrayal does not end when the truth comes out. It demands participation. It asks you to sacrifice yourself to preserve someone else's illusion. And I refused. I chose honesty. When investigators asked what I knew, I told the truth. Calmly, completely, not out of revenge, but survival. I would not let his choices destroy my integrity. I had already lost too much to lie for someone who had never protected me. The fallout was swift. Arun was dismissed from his position. Charges followed soon after. Our finances froze. Accounts were examined. Assets scrutinized. The comfortable life we had built collapsed under the weight of his decisions. The house we shared no longer felt like home. It felt like evidence, every room echoing with what had been lost. We stopped speaking except when necessary. He moved through the house like a shadow, bitter and defeated. I packed quietly, methodically, separating what was mine from what was no longer shared. The silence between us was no longer tense. It was final. The disaster no one saw coming was not loud or dramatic. It did not announce itself with chaos. It was systematic, ruthless, unavoidable. Each consequence followed the next with chilling precision, dismantling everything Arun once believed untouchable. And through it all, I discovered something unexpected. Strength. Not the kind that demands recognition or applause. The quiet kind. The kind that allows you to stand alone without collapsing. The kind that chooses truth even when it costs comfort. I learned that survival does not always mean saving what is broken. Sometimes it means walking away intact. As everything around me fell apart, I remained standing. And for the first time in a long while, I knew I would be all right. Rebuilding begins in silence. Not with declarations or sudden clarity, but with small, almost imperceptible shifts. It begins in mornings where the future feels unfamiliar, where the rhythm of life has changed and you must relearn it from scratch. It begins in nights where loneliness replaces fear, where the absence of chaos feels strange but oddly peaceful. Arun moved out shortly after the legal process began. There were no dramatic arguments, no final explosion of emotion. By then, we were both too exhausted for that. Our marriage ended not with shouting, but with resignation, with the quiet understanding that there was nothing left to salvage. The paperwork felt more ceremonial than painful, a formality that merely confirmed what had already been lost. The house felt different after he left. Lighter, yet emptier. The silence no longer carried tension, but it echoed with memories I hadn't yet sorted through. I found myself standing in familiar rooms, noticing details I had ignored for years. The way the light fell across the floor in the morning, the hum of appliances, the stillness that followed sunset. Life had slowed down, forcing me to sit with myself in ways I never had before. I grieved deeply. Not just the man I lost, but the life I believed in. The future I had imagined so clearly that it felt inevitable. I mourned the version of myself who trusted without hesitation, who believed that love alone was enough to keep everything intact. Letting go of that belief hurt more than losing Arun himself. Healing was not linear. Some days I felt powerful, clear-headed, grounded, certain that I had done the right thing. On those days, I moved with purpose. I made plans. I took control of the pieces of my life that were still within reach. Other days, I felt hollow. The kind of emptiness that arrives without warning, triggered by something insignificant. A familiar song, an old photograph, a memory that surfaced uninvited. On those days, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it without judgment. Slowly, clarity replaced confusion. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, searching for signs I might have missed. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently. The truth became simpler. I had trusted someone who chose deception. That was not a personal failure. It was a lesson. People asked questions they thought were helpful. If I regretted not protecting him. If I worried I had been too honest. If I thought things might have turned out differently had I chosen loyalty over truth. I listened politely, understanding that their questions came from discomfort more than concern. I did not regret my choice. Protecting someone from the consequences of betrayal only teaches them that destruction is acceptable. It reinforces the idea that harm can be erased by silence, that accountability is optional. I had lived too long prioritizing someone else's comfort over my own reality. I would not do it again. Arun faced the full weight of his actions. Legal consequences, professional loss, public scrutiny. I did not celebrate his downfall, nor did I feel responsible for it. What happened to him was the result of choices made long before I spoke the truth. I simply refused to carry the burden for him. While he faced the external consequences, I faced myself. Without the distraction of managing someone else's emotions, I began to notice my own. I recognized how often I had minimized my needs, how easily I had accepted emotional distance as normal. I saw the patterns I had ignored, the boundaries I had failed to enforce. This recognition was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. For the first time in years, I recognized the woman staring back at me. Not as someone's wife, not as a supporting role in someone else's ambition, but as an individual, capable, resilient, and deserving of honesty. I rebuilt my career with intention. I redirected my energy into work that fulfilled me rather than consumed me. I pursued opportunities one had once postponed, telling myself they could wait. I discovered confidence not rooted in validation, but in competence. Each small success reminded me that my worth had never been dependent on anyone else's approval. I rebuilt my sense of self just as deliberately. I learned to enjoy my own company. I created routines that brought me peace rather than distraction. I allowed myself to rest without guilt, to say no without explanation, to take up space without apology. Most importantly, I rebuilt my boundaries. I no longer ignored discomfort to maintain harmony. I trusted my instincts when something felt wrong. I understood that boundaries were not walls meant to keep people out, but guidelines that protected what mattered most. My time, my energy, my integrity. The disaster that shattered my marriage did not define me, but it transformed me. What once felt like an ending revealed itself as a beginning, one I would never have chosen, but one that forced me into truth. I learned that independence is not the absence of love, but the presence of self-respect. That strength does not always look like endurance. Sometimes it looks like walking away. And that rebuilding is not about returning to who you were before the damage. It is about becoming someone stronger because of it. What broke me also freed me. And in that freedom, I finally found myself. Years later, I heard about Arun through mutual acquaintances. The first time someone mentioned his name, it felt almost unreal, like hearing about a life I had left behind in fragments of memory. He's changed, they said, their voices cautious, almost reverent. He's learned a lot. Maybe he had. Maybe disaster teaches lessons that love cannot, lessons that only come when the consequences are unavoidable, when no one is left to cushion your fall. I did not know what change truly meant for him. Did it mean honesty? Accountability? A softer way of moving through the world? Or did it simply mean fear, tempered by experience? I had no way of knowing, and for the first time in years, I realized I did not need to. I had spent so long defining my life through the lens of what I had lost. My husband, the life I thought we would share, the security I believed was permanent. For years, that loss felt like a shadow following me wherever I went, a quiet reminder of trust misplaced and the fragility of the life I had built on assumptions. But over time, that shadow diminished. I learned to step out of its shape, to stop measuring myself against someone else's failures. As for me, I no longer defined my life by what I lost. I defined it by what I refused to surrender. My integrity, my agency, my right to live with honesty and self-respect. These were not gifts that could be taken or returned. They were choices I made repeatedly when the easier path was to compromise or ignore the truth. It took years to fully grasp how much of my strength came not from external validation, but from the quiet decisions I made every day to stand by myself. I watched people around me build lives based on convenience, alliances, and appearances. I saw marriages survive on pretense, careers advance on deception. And I realized that surviving, truly surviving, was not about shielding oneself from pain. It was about refusing to participate in the harm that others invited into your life. Arun's betrayal had been catastrophic. The collapse it caused was immense, precise, and unavoidable. But it also revealed something important. Lies always demand payment. Always. And when the bill arrives, it is never small. Consequences are impartial. They arrive quietly at first, a ripple in routine, then gather into waves that cannot be stopped. Those who believe they can manipulate the course of reality through charm or deceit will one day find that reality is more patient, more relentless, and more exacting than they ever imagined. I survived, not by hardening my heart, not by shutting out emotion or cloistering myself in resentment. I survived by choosing truth over comfort, even when truth was terrifying, even when it meant watching the life I loved unravel. I chose honesty when lies would have been easier, calmer, safer. I chose clarity when confusion promised illusion. And that choice, painful as it was, saved me. In the years that followed, I discovered that freedom is not the absence of fear or uncertainty. Freedom is the presence of choice, the ability to act with integrity, to prioritize what is right over what is convenient, to refuse to sacrifice yourself for someone else's recklessness. Freedom is standing in the quiet of your own life and realizing that the world may have betrayed you, but you have not betrayed yourself. I rebuilt slowly, carefully. My home, my career, my friendships, they were no longer extensions of someone else's identity. I cultivated them for myself. I invested in people who treated honesty and respect as non-negotiable. I celebrated accomplishments that had nothing to do with recognition or reward, but with proof of my own perseverance. Every small success became a brick in the foundation of a life rebuilt on truth rather than illusion. Sometimes, I would think about the moments when I had felt powerless. I remembered the nights spent lying awake, listening to Arun's movements, weighing the tiny details of his deception. I remembered driving past that cafe, watching the intimacy that was not mine to witness. I remembered the suffocating quiet of the house after the legal documents were signed, when the rooms no longer reflected comfort but consequence. And yet, each memory became a measure of resilience rather than regret. Each memory reminded me that survival is a decision, repeated in countless small ways. Choosing honesty over comfort, boundaries over obligation, self-respect over fear. In that sense, my life after betrayal was not a return to normalcy. It was a transformation. I discovered that betrayal, for all its cruelty, can also serve as a catalyst for profound self-realization. It forces you to confront not only the faults of others, but also your own assumptions, your own vulnerabilities, your own strengths. I learned to trust my instincts, to recognize the signs of duplicity early, and to value clarity over convenience. I became someone who could navigate the world with eyes open, unflinching, unwilling to trade integrity for comfort. And yet, I did not close myself off. I did not harden so thoroughly that life became cold. Love, friendship, and connection still mattered to me, but I approached them with intention rather than assumption. I learned to recognize when boundaries were necessary, when self-preservation required a firm stance, and when generosity could coexist with discernment. I discovered that a life built on honesty is not only survivable, it can be beautiful, even after devastation. Hearing about Arun years later, I felt nothing like the old pain. There was no longing, no bitterness, no desire for revenge. If he had changed, I could only hope it was genuine, but it was no longer my concern. His life and its lessons had diverged from mine, and I had my own path to walk. One forged by the choices I refused to compromise, by the resilience I refused to surrender. The years of reconstruction taught me a final, crucial truth. Sometimes, the worst betrayal becomes the beginning of the strongest chapter of your life. When everything you thought was secure falls away, you are left with a rare gift. The opportunity to rebuild from the foundation up, without illusions, without compromise, and with a clear understanding of who you are. I had thought the story ended with destruction. I had thought survival meant merely enduring. But survival had given me something more. It had given me clarity, strength, independence, the certainty that no one could ever undermine my sense of self again, not deceit, not betrayal, not circumstance. And so I continued, quietly, purposefully, with the knowledge that a life rebuilt on truth is resilient, that boundaries are liberation, and that integrity is the most precious inheritance a person can claim from their own trials. Betrayal had demanded a payment, and the cost had been high. But in that cost, I had discovered value I would never have found otherwise. The life I lost to deceit became the life I reclaimed for myself. The disaster no one saw coming became the foundation for a life that could withstand anything. I survived. I rebuilt. I flourished. And in that survival, I found a truth more enduring than love alone. The strongest life is the one you live honestly, courageously, and entirely for yourself.